now. Okay, welcome to the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing here at the University of Lancaster. I'm going to hand over 1 second to my colleague, Professor Terry Eagleton, Distinguished Professor of English Literature here, and Terry's going to be talking to a seminar series that he's leading over the last couple of years called What Every Student Could Possibly Ever Need to Know Regarding ... Today it's realism. So I hand over to Terry.
Thanks, John. Hi. I want to talk today, as John says, about the idea of literature and to raise the question of what it is. What is literature? It might be worth pointing out in that respect that Shakespeare would not, I think, have regarded his work as part of literature. He wrote theatre scripts, just as somebody might write scripts for EastEnders, for example, and he would probably have been astonished that centuries later people were studying his work still as literature, a category which wouldn't, I think, have been available to him. We'd be even more astonished, no doubt, if in a few hundred years' time people were studying the scripts of EastEnders, but who knows, they might be. Why wouldn't Shakespeare have seen his own work as literary? Well, as I say, because the concept of literature in our modern sense wasn't really invented at that time. It emerged in the late 18th century, in the sense that we know it. That's to say, a special, maybe rather privileged body of writing, which is creative and imaginative, and to that extent is distinct from other forms of writing. It's not an accident, historically, that notion of writing begins to occur in the late 18th century, the beginning of the Romantic period. It gathers pace during that period because it was the same time as the emergence of industrial capitalism in Britain, the oldest industrial capitalist nation in the world, and the sense that daily life was becoming more and more mechanized, more and more uncreative, factory life, led to a certain as it were, attempt to cultivate certain imaginative and creative values, which were increasingly felt not to be available in the more general social life. And that area, that little enclave, was hived off and called by various names over the decades. You'd call it the arts, or humanities, or civilization, maybe, or, yes, you could call it literature. Earlier than that, if one looks back to the early and mid 18th century, there isn't that distinction. People don't divide writing so much into those different categories. Literature for the earlier 18th century, the concept of literature would include, say, scientific writing, historiography, the writing about history, philosophy, and so on. The greatest, or so many think, the greatest British philosopher, David Hume, who was also a Scot. He wrote straight philosophy and history, but his writing would certainly have been considered as part of literature. Literature in that age was really a social category rather than intellectual or academic one. It really meant the kind of writing that is fit for a gentleman. Fine writing, well-bred or polite letters is a phrase that was used as against certain socially rather low and ill-bred forms. And they, to our surprise today, would certainly have included the novel, which was regarded as a sort of upstart, rather bastardized, mongrel vulgar literary version, or I say literary form of writing, but was not really regarded as literature. It wasn't really fit for genteel consumption. Even more so, you might say, theatre. Drama would not have been regarded as literature because that was even more low life, you know. So the novel and drama, all about thieves and sex workers and pickpockets, that wasn't considered literature on social grounds. Right? Now, over the years, people have tried to define what counts as literature, what is literature, and I think it's probably the case that nobody has really been successful in doing that until today. I mean, this very day, 24th of May, 2021, I will actually reveal to you, but don't spread it around, the secret of what literature is, right? And this is far more important historically than the death of the Duke of Edinburgh or anything like that. So here we go. It's a common mistake to think of literature as just being defined in one way. That's to say that every work we call literary must have a particular feature in common with every other work we call literature. This is sometimes known as essentialism, that there's an essence of literature. There's some feature or set of features that all the works we call literary must share. And then we look around those works and we say, well, what is it? So what's the alternative approach to essentialism? Well, the alternative to essentialism is really something called nominalism, which, as the name suggests, involves the idea of names. That's to say, the argument that really the things, all the assorted things we call literature, have nothing more in common but the name literature. However, that instantly raises a question, which is, then why do we call all these things by the same name, if in fact they don't really have anything in common? However, essentialism and nominalism are not the only alternatives. We don't have to think either there's only one or a set number of features that distinguishes what counts as literature, or alternatively, there are no such features whatsoever. There's a third possibility, which some would argue the greatest English language philosopher of the modern period, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was Austrian but wrote in English, which he develops in this sense. Wittgenstein says, if you're thinking about this kind of problem, think of games. What is it that everything that we call a game has in common with everything else we call a game? What's the one feature they share? Wittgenstein argues that there is no one feature shared in common by, say, chess and Ludo and whist and tennis and football, so on. Are they all competitive? No. A child throwing a ball against a wall is playing a game, but not competing with anybody. Do they all have an audience? No. Chess doesn't necessarily have an audience. What you see, Wittgenstein argues, is a set of overlapping and crisscrossing features as between all these different things to which we give the name of game. One game, for example, might have, say, 3 of these features, and then in another game, one of them might drop out and be replaced by another, and then in a third game, the features may be combined in a different way, but they're all games. And Wittgenstein says, he writes all this in a fascinating book called Philosophical Investigations. He says, think of this in terms of family resemblances. Think of looking at a series of photos of a family over the generations. They look alike often to some extent, but not necessarily, because they all have one feature in common, red hair or large flapping ears, Prince Charles type years. Prince Charles's ears are said to be the only thing visible from space apart from the Great Wall of China. I don't know if that's true. Now, that kind of series, the kind of series that Wittgenstein is talking about, where you have overlapping and crisscrossing features which occur in different combinations in each example of, say, a game or, say, literature, that's technically known as polythetic, and that's Polythetic, polythetic. You don't need to bother too much about that. But the Oxford English Dictionary defines the polythetic as a classification which is based on a number of shared characteristics, no one of which is essential for membership of the class. So a set of shared characteristics, they do have things in common. To that extent, the essentialists are right, but in a way, the nominalists are right too, because there's no one feature that necessarily occurs in all of these different cases. And it follows from that there could be two members of the same series, let's say if you're thinking about works of literature, which actually have nothing in common, because they're part of this ongoing overlapping sequence, but two of them might have no single feature in common. Okay, now how then does this apply to literature? Well, what are the crisscrossing features there? I want to argue that when it's always wise, so Wittgenstein says, when you're trying to define something, and there's no need for a definition of everything we do. I mean, we do lots of things without needing to define them, but sometimes it's intriguing to know how you would define something. When you're trying to do that, Wittgenstein says, always listen to the way the word is actually used by people. And if you think of the word literature, it's used by people in different ways. And I want to suggest, this is the historic contribution to human knowledge that I'm just about to make, so don't switch off, that when people talk about a piece of writing being literary, they generally have one of 5 different features in mind. First of all, they may mean that it's fiction. It's not literally true, it's fiction, right? Or, and this is quite different, they may mean that it uses language in some peculiarly creative or inventive or imaginative way, all right? Unlike the telephone directory, for instance. Or they mean that it's a particularly fine example of writing, though you'd have to define, of course, what you meant by that. That's, I think, 3 features already. It's fiction, it's a particularly kind of inventive language, it's fine writing. 4th feature, that it's non-pragmatic. That simply means it has no immediate obvious use in the way that, say, a bus ticket does. It has no practical function, at least in its immediate context, all right? And finally, the 5th feature I want to argue for is it means a piece of language, which is a bit of writing, which is in some sense, and this is a tricky term, moral. Now, by moral, I don't mean some kind of moral commandment or injunction, do this, don't do this, don't do that. I mean moral in the sense that it refers to the qualities and values of human experience. So a statement like, parting is such sweet sorrow is a moral statement, whereas a statement like she stood in front of the cathedral door isn't. It doesn't say anything yet about the quality of human experience. I don't mean by moral didactic statements, though there's a fine current of didactic literature. Statements like, for example, thou shalt not steal, which is very clearly a moral injunction. Interesting injunction, though, because theologians these days tend to believe that it doesn't refer to private property. There wasn't much private property around in ancient Hebrew society. They think it refers to kidnapping, stealing men. One tribe would steal the young men of another tribe for their labor power. Anyway, I'm not supposed to be lecturing on the Ten Commandments, so actually you could go through them and reinterpret them in interesting ways. Now, the first thing to note about these 5 features is that no one of them is unique to literature. We don't find any one of them only in literature. Fiction, obvious fact. I mean, there are all kinds of fiction, say advertisements that people don't call literary. Most of what came out of the Trump White House was fiction, you know, but people don't elevate it and ennoble it by the title of literary. Some of what's coming out of the Israeli Defense Force at the moment is fiction, or more precisely, barefaced lies, but we don't dignify that with the title of literature. Then the same goes for imaginative and inventive language. You can find that all over the place. You can find it in pubs. Again, you can find it in advertisements. You can find it in the sometimes rather feeble wordplay of the Sun newspaper. It's not confined, not unique to what people call literary. The same goes for non-pragmatic writing. You know, a children's song in the street, a street game, that's non-pragmatic. It has no immediate practical function, but it's not, we would think, part of literature. And finally, what about literature as particularly fine writing? Well, first of all, of course, we'd have to look at the criteria by which people decide what's fine writing and what isn't. And those criteria shift a great deal historically and culturally. But secondly, the problem with that, if literature means fine writing, what do we mean by bad literature? People do, don't they, sometimes use the phrase, that's pretty third-rate literature. They still think it's literature, but they don't think it's much good. So, you know, on this idea, all literature must be fine literature, which I don't think is true. Second general point to note here is that some of what we call literary works combine all of these characteristics. You'll find all of them there. Othello, for example. Othello is fictional. It's a very highly inventive use of language. It's not pragmatic. There's no immediate way of using the text. It's certainly moral in that it's a deep exploration of human values, meanings and qualities, and it's generally agreed to be fine literature, though who knows, in 200 years' time, people might not find Othello fine literature. In other cases, however, only one or two of those features may be enough to call a piece of writing literary. You might call, say, a sermon literary, a very important literary genre called, you know, the sermon. You might call it literature because it's moral and it may be finely written, so it satisfies two of those criteria, but it's not exactly fictional, and it's not, for many people, non-pragmatic, because it might be out to change, you know, how people behave, how they feel. So all kinds of combinations of those 5 aspects are possible, but my argument would be that at least one of these factors must be present. So it's not a case of anything goes. If everything is literature, if all writing is literature, then the word literature ceases to have meaning. It doesn't demarcate anything specific. But on the other hand, neither is the word tightly definitive of a particular piece of writing. It's an open-ended kind of work. Okay, third point, general point to make is that some works, this is an example of how some works don't meet one or more of those criteria. Some works we call literary are not, for example, fictional. Diaries, essays. Some people in the 19th century would probably have called Darwin's work as part of literature. In the 18th century, maybe Isaac Newton's work would count as part of it. I've already mentioned David Hume's philosophy. So literature doesn't have to be fictional to be literary. Again, to take another criterion, fine language that quite often calls attention to itself, as in poetry, language as it were obtrudes its presence on the reader, so we're aware that we're in the presence of language, and everything that happens in a literary work happens in terms of language. Well, that's true of some literature, to be sure. It's true of Keats, it's true of Shakespeare, it's true of Hopkins. It's not really true, is it, of, say, Ernest Hemingway. It's not true of lyrical ballads, where Wordsworth and Coleridge write a deliberately kind of plain, spare, everyday, idiomatic diction. A lot of what we include under literature isn't particularly outstanding or unusual or idiosyncratic in its use of language. I've already pointed out, as far as another criterion goes, that some of what we call literature isn't exactly fine writing. We might say of a very, of a certain kind of Jacobean tragedy or piece of 18th century pastoral poetry. Well, it's literature insofar as it belongs to a genre which we recognize as being literary, but it's a very mediocre example of it. We might want to say it's literature, but it's not very good. As for moral and non-pragmatic, well, Virgil's Georgics, very renowned text of classical antiquity, is actually a kind of manual for beekeepers. Although, as your beekeeping friends, of whom I'm sure you have many hundreds, would tell you, it's not very reliable. But it's not exactly what we would call moral in that wide sense of the word, and it's fairly pragmatic as well. It's telling you actually how to do things. Okay, let me finally move on just to really a rather different point, which is not a question of the definition of literature so much as how do we read the stuff. The most common mistake, I think, that students of literature make when they're confronted with a literary work is to ignore the form and attend only to the content, is, as it were, to look right through the language at what it means. And by form, ignoring form, I don't just mean meter or rhyme. I mean everything which concerns how a piece of language operates rather than just what it says. And how would include things like tone, which is very vital, mood, rhythm, pace, syntax, texture, sound texture, all of those things. There was a critic of T.S. Eliot who once said that of a particular passage in T.S. Eliot's writing, he says, there's something very sad about the punctuation. And that's really rather a classic example of literary criticism. The critic is looking not simply at what the extractable meaning of the passage is, but actually how it goes about saying what it says. A lot of students of literature these days, and actually one must confess quite a lot of teachers of literature, can talk about, say, ethnic stereotypes in the literature, in the text, but on the whole, they can't say things like the poem's exuberant tone is curiously at odds with its shambling syntax. Yes. And that means that they're not really doing literary criticism. They're treating literature as some kind of documentary or history or sociology. They're not coming to terms with the shape of the sentences. They're not looking at what is said in terms of how it's said. And that, if you like, is the archetypal critical act to try and do that. Just to end, let me take very quickly, as an example of this, the famous opening sentence of, I'm sure you know it, Ian Foster's A Passage to India. Except for the Marabar Caves, and they are 20 miles off, the city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. Well, note first of all the syntax. Except for the Marabar Caves, and they are 20 miles off. We open with a subclause. We kind of sidle into the subject sideways. We don't address it head on. It would ruin the whole poise of the sentence to say, the city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary except for the Marabar Caves. The balance and rhythm of the sentence would be greatly disturbed. It would be too blunt. It would be too in your face. It would be too much like, say, a piece of reportage or journalism. Note that the sentence also starts with the Marabar Caves, except for the Marabar Caves, because they are going to be absolutely central to the narrative that the novel is about to deliver. They're going to be, as it were, the centre around which the novel turns, and yet there's an insistent question in the novel, which, if you've read it, you'll be aware of. Are the caves important or are they not? Are they just hollows in the rock? Did anything crucial happen in the caves in the course of the narrative, or didn't it? So that ambiguity is reflected in the structure of the sentence, the opening sentence itself, except for the Marabar Caves, which sort of marginalizes them, fends them off a bit, and they are 20 miles off. But at the same time, the novel opens on that keynote, on those keywords, the Marabar Caves. The sentence is, you might say, elegant, but in an unshowy kind of way. It's very deftly managed, but there's no excessively, as it were, fine writing. It's not drawing too much ostentatious attention to itself. There's a bit of subdued alliteration, caves, city, Chandrapur, but not much beyond that. And the tone is extraordinarily important in the way we respond to a work of literature. So is mood, difficult to define. Tone and mood were very crucial. The tone is that perhaps of a rather jaded tourist who's seen too much of the world to be easily impressed. Maybe an Englishman not given to extravagant outpourings of enthusiasm, slightly disenchanted tones, faintly supercilious, maybe. The city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. A touch overbread, that of a rather snooty kind of guidebook, you might say. But there's also, final point I make, a grammatical ambiguity about the sentence itself. It looks fairly transparent, doesn't it? Fairly self-evident, but there's a mystery about its meaning, just as there's going to be an enormous mystery about the Marabar Caves. Except for the Marabar Caves, and they are 20 miles off, the city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. What does that mean? I mean, are the caves in the city or not? Except for the caves, the city presents nothing extraordinary, would suggest that the caves are in the city, but then we're told they're 20 miles off from the city. So there's a deep indeterminacy in the first sentence about where the caves are. Are they in the city, which the sentence seems to affirm, or are they 20 miles away? And that will later develop, as I say, into the ambiguity, the sense of indeterminacy which surrounds the caves themselves. Okay, so I've tried to tell you what literature is, on this very historic morning, when the key to it has now been delivered to you. And I've also tried to tell you a little bit about how to go about analysing, and so, there's nothing left to be said. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. Already got one question in the chat bar, which is wonderful. So I will read that to you. Can you see that question in your chat?
Yes, I can, John. Yes.
Okay. Well, in that case,
mentioned Hemingway. Sorry, I could only see part. Part of it, John.
Okay,
and now it's gone.
Okay. The question is from Kevin Brooks. You mentioned Hemingway as not demonstrating fine writing, but with the rhythm of his simple sentences, he has established a sort of school of such writing, e.g. Raymond Carver.
Mm-hmm. So, that's a very interesting point. You put your finger on it. You might say that Hemingway pushes a kind of stylelessness to the point where it becomes a kind of style in itself and then becomes much imitated. So the way that Hemingway, for example, uses the copula, meaning the word and, stringing clauses together by the word and, that's of course now a very common style, for example, in American writing, and you mentioned Carver as an example of it. It's in a sense deliberately inelegant, you can't imagine somebody like Foster doing that, or Golding, or Iris Murdoch, but it's pushed to an extent, and exactly the spareness, the simplicity, is pushed to an extent where it becomes a style all in itself, and therefore becomes imitable. In other words, if you push it, put it another way, if you push a certain kind of plain realism far enough, it turns into a kind of modernism, and that, I suppose, is one of the ways we characterize Hemingway.
Cheers, thank you, Kevin. And a question here from DS. So please do just turn your mic on, DS, and or your camera, and fire away.
Yeah.
Hi.
Am I audible?
Yeah, hi there, Dolly. Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you. Carry on.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your lecture. From my undergraduate days, I was, keen to learn what characterizes literature as literature. So thank you for that. And secondly, like you said that, so my first point is that I read an essay entitled "What is Literature?" when I was in my bachelor's. So the essay says that everything is literature, whether it is a letter written to a friend or whether it is an email written to email. So everything characterizes as literature. Although by through your lecture, you negated the validity of that argument, is what I have realized. And second point is that you said that students students of literature today, are only focused on the themes that are raised in the text, and so they are keen to figure out the content and the characters and all the things that we are engaged with when we read a text. But and then you said that we need to examine the form of the text, which constitutes the meter and all. So I was really keen to learn the meter of the romantic poem that I would read, or Tennyson's poem and Browning's poems, dramatic monologue. But seems to be that no one has the time to teach students that kind of literary criticism today, which you are advocating for. So what is the way out in this situation?
Okay, thanks, Dolly. 2 points you're making, really. The first, everything is literature. That's quite a common belief, I think. But there's a distinction, isn't there, between the way people use the word literature and the way they use the word writing. quite a lot of people would think that some kinds of writing are not literature. The problem with everything is definitions, everything is political, everything is moral, everything is literature, is they don't really mean anything. If you stretch a word, to its very limits, it tends to be emptied of meaning. It has no cutting edge. For a term to be meaningful, surely it has to distinguish something. It has to be, say, this, not that. I'm talking about a cup and not a saucer. Yeah, and I think that's true of the word literature, as it's true of other words. Not very helpful to say everything is. It kind of cancels all the way through. Well, if everything is something, then why do we even use the word? Yeah. Your point about form is very relevant, although notice I don't mean by form simply meter. Is it the iambic pentameter? That's the way that, again, a lot of students have been trained to think. It includes that for sure, or rhyme, assonance, alliteration. But you remember what I tried also to talk about are things like mood, tone, pace, verbal texture, syntax, these rather less palpable aspects of the way the language actually forms, how you experience the feel and the shape of the sentences. So form in that sense means more than meter. And I'm very sorry if, as you say, it's the case that students don't get a chance to learn this too much these days, because for me, I'm very old-fashioned, of course, as you can see. I was born in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. For me, attending to the quality of language is quintessentially what literary criticism is about. Anybody can say, well, the stories about this guy who met this woman and, etc., a plot developed. But what they can't really say is the poem's exuberant tone is curiously at odds with its shambling syntax, which is a kind of funny thing to say, but that gets at what I mean by form. Okay, thank you, Dolly.
Thank you, Dolly. Got a question here from Ted Junior Osterwald in the chat bar. He missed the beginning of the lecture, but he's got a good question here. So, in one of your lectures, Terry, one of your later remarks in the lecture, you say that students of literature confuse content and form, particularly vis-a-vis social issues. This might be true, perhaps people are reading in too much, but can you expand on how you propose we study and make sense of social issues of power as evoked in literature? Do you not agree that scholarship should lead to better ethics?
Well, now, if you have 3 days, I might be able to answer that question. It's a very important question, of course. Let me just say, first of all, a quick word about power. When literary students and a lot of other people hear the word power, they almost always think of it in negative terms. Autocratic power, oppressive, authoritarian power. So why? I mean, there are all kinds of facilitating powers as well. The power of certain kinds of experience, the power of organized labor, the power of organized anti-racist groups, whatever it is. Yeah. Power is not by any means confined to an oppressive meaning. I think power is, let me put it this way, I think it's a wonderful thing. I mean, personally, I can't get enough of it. It all depends on who has it, in what situations, for what purposes. And that's not always a matter, of an oppressor. Power is needed to liberate yourself as well. Well, clearly, there's a close nexus between language and power in general. Let's leave aside for a moment the question of literature. The point where power impacts upon language is known as ideology. Ideology is what happens in language when it's subjected to certain pressures of power. sometimes to the point where language is then deflected, as it were, from the truth, and becomes a question of convenience or authority or empowerment or disempowerment. Certainly, because literature is written in that medium of language, it can't avoid questions of power and ideology. Simply by writing, in a sense, you're already complicit with those, but it can, we sometimes have to remind ourselves of this, in a period when power is sometimes seen to be all-pervasive and unshakable, it can also act as a resistance to certain forms of power, clearly. Think of feminist literature. Power is not as well-rooted as it likes to present itself as. Just as we as individuals like to present ourselves as much more secure and stable than many of us feel we actually are, so power presents itself in this impregnable way. But I mentioned David Hume, the great 18th century philosopher, in my talk. David Hume once said something very interesting about that. He said, in the end, power depends on the common people. What does he mean? Not that the common people had power. David Hume didn't think they had and didn't want them to have, but he saw that no power can be legitimate for any length of time which isn't at least silently endorsed by a sufficient number of people. You can't fool all the people all the time, though you can maybe fool some of them all of the time, or all of them some of the time. Yeah? And to that extent, power has a more precarious basis. It needs the implicit or passive consent of those that it rules over in order to be effective. And I think it knows that. Okay.
Thank you. Kevin Brooks, yes, mentioning Foucault in that connection. Foucault equals, maybe you want to respond to this, Terry. Foucault, he points out, equals power, both positive and negative, as you are saying, or neutral. Do you want to comment on Foucault in relation to what you just saying?
Yes. I was aware that when I just said what I said, that somebody might very rightly pick up on the work of Michel Foucault. Foucault, of course, wants to say that power is in a certain way enabling. It's not just oppressive. We owe it to Foucault and others to point that out to us. But Foucault doesn't mean by enabling, I think, morally positive. Foucault is extremely wary of the ethical, because he would have to eventually ask the question, where do ethics come from? He means power can facilitate, it can enable us to do things, that's a fact. But he doesn't mean that power is morally positive in the sense of to be morally affirmed in certain contexts. And I think that's a limitation on Foucault's idea of power. He certainly gets away from a sheerly neutral or oppressive model of it, but he won't go all the way and affirm certain kinds of power as morally admirable and reputable, because that's not the kind of language which Foucault is prepared to use. And I think that's a limit in his work.
Cheers, thank you, Kevin. Terry, to follow up, well, a different question really from Ted Osterwal. Terry, could you kindly clarify why you hate queer theory? I don't quite sure what Ted's.
That's what you might call a partisan question. Well, first of all, I like the evidence that I hate queer theory. I don't write about queer theory. I'm not queer. You don't have to be queer to write about it. But then there are plenty of things I don't write about. Yeah, I don't believe that any critic has to, in some coercive or morally coercive way, write about this or that. I write about what I want to write about, and if that doesn't include queer theory particularly, nor does it include a lot of other things. I think that there shouldn't be some kind of, as it were, orthodoxy here, whereby critics or writers are presented, with a list of topics, say you've got to write about that. If a feminist gives a brilliant lecture, let's say, on gender in Virginia Woolf, it's now happened about 5,000 times, yes, I wouldn't stand up in the audience and say, hey, why didn't you mention the fact that Virginia Woolf belonged to a very small social elite and in some ways was odiously snobbish? Why should I? Why should I say, you've got to mention that fact? If her paper is fine as far as it goes, then that satisfies me. Nobody can say everything all the time, nor should they be required to.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Thank you, Terry. Another question here, completely different, from Anne O'Brien, one of our students. I'd love to hear Terry's views on memoir / autofiction and its popularity, I think, or even populism, certainly in Ireland at the present. Yes.
Can I just add one comment to the last speaker's question? I put this very succinctly, and I put it provocatively. In my view, what rules the world is not ethnicity, and is not gender, and is not sexual tendency, vital though those things are. What rules the world is capital. And I wonder why supposedly radical critics or students don't really talk about that anymore. Is that something to do with our rather dire political situation, I wonder? Memoir, yes. I mean, some years ago, I actually even contributed, alas, to the genre myself. I wrote a memoir. I have a kind, although I wrote one, I must confess I have a kind of allergy to the genre in a certain way. What I don't like, this is purely a personal aversion, are biographies of writers. Why write about what a writer had for breakfast? What does it matter? You know, the only reason people write about, you know, where a writer went on a certain day or who they married or divorced is because they're a writer. They wouldn't write about this about anybody else. And in my view, the fact that they're a writer has very little to do with who they were married to or they had for breakfast, how many children they had, and so on. That's classically known as the biographical fallacy, where people, not so much these days, but used to read literary works as though they were the reflection of personal authorial experience, which must logically mean that at some point in his life, Shakespeare was mad and wild and out on a heath with fools and madmen, which is crazy. Of course, there's a valid genre of biography or life writing or memoir, which doesn't make that mistake. But I think, you know, there's a particularly English overemphasis on the biographical. Publishers tell one that biography is an immensely popular form in Britain, much more so, of course, than the literature about which the author wrote, when we're talking about literary biography. It's a kind of, you know, the question, okay, you know, Sense and Sensibility is fair enough, but who was the person behind the novel? Michel Foucault would say, what does it matter? I think there's something in that answer.
Anne had a particular interest in Ireland, Terry. You mentioned the Englishness or Britishness of autobiography. You know, she wanted. Is there? What would you say? Anything specific to Ireland in relation?
I have little to say about that. I mean, I lived in Ireland for about 25 years, and I know there are some very fine memoir, but alas, I know very little about it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Dolly has got a question to do with deconstruction. So I think she writes, Derrida's model of deconstruction, the futility of tracing the logos, challenges new criticism. In your account, you have stressed a recourse to new criticism. So how do you intend to challenge Derrida?
I'm not quite sure what Dolly means by my having recourse to new criticism. I talk certainly about close analysis, which new criticism is famed for, but there are many different kinds of close analysis, say Leavis or I. Richards, William Empson, which are not new critical. New criticism was a particular kind of post-Second World War American form of close analysis with all kinds of ideological assumptions to it. Challenging Derrida, well, there's a great deal that I've learned from Derrida, my earlier work. What I suppose one of the several points on which I would disagree with post-structuralism in general, not just deconstruction, is I don't think that indeterminacy or ambivalence or ambiguity are ipso facto positive. Whereas the tendency of post-structuralism is to imagine that the open-ended and indeterminate and pluralistic and heterogeneous is always, in every situation, more valuable than their opposites. That's a form of dogmatism. It's even a form of universalism, which post-structuralism is supposed to oppose. There are situations in which you don't want language to be determinate, to be indeterminate, open-ended, ambiguous, and multiple, like, for example, shouting fire in a theatre. You know, you don't want people to wonder what the hell you're talking about. More, less frivolously, you don't want that kind of language to be indeterminate when you're speaking the language, say, of anti-racism, you know? There's a deep political implication in post-structuralism's elevation of the ambiguous, pluralistic, open-ended, and so on. It belongs to a kind of post-ideological world in which the very idea of conviction has now become suspect as a secret form of dogmatism. You know? Postmodernists don't like the idea of conviction. To them, strangely, it's too close to dogmatism. But you see, they live in a kind of Western middle-class world in which that may well be a possible stance to take. If you're somewhere else in the world, fighting a different kind of struggle, you may need to know what the situation is with you as clearly and precisely as possible. And it's a kind of privilege to think that not knowing, not being definitive, not having convictions is somehow superior to the other situation. It's also simply a modern form of middle-class liberalism, because traditionally liberalism has believed much the same thing.
Thank you. We've got 6 minutes, I think, maximum. We've got a couple of questions here. So Keith Claxton, interesting question. You mentioned earlier how plays were not once considered literature by those in the 18th century. Why do you think that was the case when they had all presumably been classically educated on the great Greek plays?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think that, I mean, really, what I was talking about, I suppose, in the 18th century was more contemporary drama. Yes. Much of which was anyway not, as it were, classical in stature. It was vaudeville or burlesque or whatever, farce. And then a gentleman, an 18th century gentleman, like, say, Sam Johnson, would make a fairly clear distinction between drama, which for him or her, mainly him, belonged to classical literature as a whole, so that what you were valuing there was not so much the dramatic elements of it, but the literary ones, and then contemporary theatre, which was really, as it were, non-literary, which didn't reach supposedly that kind of standard. So yes, the influence of Greek tragedy, of course, is extraordinarily important, we know, for the greatest high point of drama in British society, which is still unsurpassed, which is the age from, say, 1580 to 1620, something like that. Not surprising that that enormous flowering of the drama coincides with what you might call the emergence of modernity. The first creepings of what we now recognize to be a modern, post-feudal, post-traditional society. It's often pointed out, I'm going rather beyond the question here, I'm sorry, sometimes pointed out that great tragedy, for example, as with the Greeks, as with Elizabethans and Jacobeans, as with Ibsen and Chekhov and modern tragic writers for the stage, tends to occur at moments of historic transition between one social order, which is sort of dying but dead on its feet, still quite powerful, and the emergence of another social order which is challenging the old one but hasn't yet got the kinds of self-assurance and robustness to do that definitively. There's a logjam, a tension, a conflict between the older and the newer, and from that, major periods of tragic drama tend to emerge.
Can perhaps squeeze in one last question. We've got 3 minutes here. John Weston, regarding the autobiographical fallacy or biographical fallacy, is there a corresponding pedagogical fallacy? In other words, should we not expect great writers to be able to teach or explain or criticize their own work? And that may be obviously part of literary memoir, or part of the so-called point of literary memoir.
Yes. That again is a very interesting question. Writers that we regard as great, sometimes say the silliest things about their own work, don't they? When Eliot was once asked what The Wasteland was about, he said, "Oh, it's just a kind of rhythmical grousing." Well, sorry, but it's not. You know, there's no reason we should take the author's view as definitive. Anyway, he was just having a bit of a joke, as Eliot tended to do. But no, I think that, you know, somebody once said the author is the first reader of his or her writing. In some respects, the author is in the same position as the reader, because there are meanings of any literary work which he or she can't control, yes, which are bound to escalate beyond what they consciously intend and so on. Yes, I think we should perhaps be a little cautious about accepting the author's word as the last one. Robert Browning, who was given to writing very obscure poetry in the 19th century, was once asked by a woman, a fan of his, what a certain poem of his meant, and he replied, "Madam, when I wrote that poem, God and Robert Browning knew what it meant. Now God knows." Yeah? He was disowning any responsibility. Obviously, there are limits to that. You know. Let me just add, and the speaker didn't raise this question, but I think it's relevant. I would also question what I might call the public intellectual fallacy. It's quite widespread idea, and I don't know how this comes about, that writers have a particular responsibility to speak out on public matters. I deeply believe in the category of a public intellectual, that is to say, one who speaks beyond academia. I've tried in my own career, in my own life, to do that as far as possible. But I don't see what it is about being a writer, as opposed to being a window cleaner or an estate agent, which imbues you with a certain privilege in that regard. Most writers in British society now share what I find is a rather boring, middle class, middle of the road, liberal ideology. Almost all of them do, you know? And I therefore don't think that in their speaking out on a war or a famine or a political situation is necessarily any more impressive or influential than anybody else speaking out.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for your excellent questions. And we've got a lot of appreciation going on in the chat bar, Terry, that you may or may not be able to see. I think it's the first time Terry's ever seen a chat bar, by the way, folks. So thank you, everybody, and